This recommendation, as many of you know, was approved by acclamation in the General Conference of UNESCO in November 2021. And since then, it has really set the narrative on how important it is to include the ethics and the protection and promotion of human rights in the digital world. Next, please. It's always important to remember that this is another technological wave, like electricity, like telephony, like many other waves that we have experienced. But it's not only the most pervasive, but it's also the fastest. And after COVID, what you can see there is how much the private investment on AI has just tripled, quadrupled, how much the penetration of these technologies is also advancing very fast, and therefore is changing the way we engage, the way we work, the way we live. And it really gets us into realizing how our world would change when this kind of investment continue to be increasing in this level of intensity. Next, please. This is an amazing chart. This is the time taken to reach 1 million users per month, calculated by months. And we know now that ChatGPT took 1 month to get 100 million users. I was one of them. First one to, and I'm going to tell you later what I asked ChatGPT, and I was not happy with the answer. But at the end, it's really telling you that these are too fast. If you see this kind of speed, of course, it poses real challenges. Next, please. Then the question, we all know the positive sides. We know how fast they can provide us with services. We know how they can be used on the health sector, on the food sector, maximizing, optimizing production systems. It's really technologies that are facilitating our work, our connections, and the way we deal with things. More and more public and private decisions are taken by artificial intelligence. And therefore, it's really a tool that is helping us deliver better services and better outcomes. But we know the downsides. And this is what UNESCO and everybody that is concerned about these technologies have been looking at in terms of these technologies reproducing the biases, reproducing the inequalities, reproducing many of the downsides that we have in the real world. But the problem is that this is in the digital world that is even less transparent. And therefore, privacy, surveillance, and serious human rights concerns are also worrying threats. In this graph, what you see is just what we have picked up from some of the headlines in terms of the discriminatory outcomes that some of these developments have had, and how can we control them. And then in the next graph, you will also see what we have also captured. If you go to the next, please, regarding ChatGPT. And the recommendation first statement is that you should not release any new development without having a full ethics assessment ex ante. Because what happens is that we release these developments and then we start realizing what are the impacts, and we start looking, oh my God, but they might be sexist or they might discriminate, but we know it when they are already available. And I think the ex-ante ethical assessment is really important. This is just 2 weeks after the ChatGPT was released, and how the controversy has been sparked by the answers and the non-reliability of many of the answers that it provides. Next, please. So the other reflection is that there was no global standard to deal with these issues. We have many standards that industry is taking on board. We have many standards in the OECD, in many other places, but not a single global standard. The private companies have their own standards, but at the end, it's not the private companies who settle the legal frameworks. And therefore, this was a gap that was realized by member states of UNESCO when they decided to give the mandate to organization to develop their recommendation, based, of course, of the experience of this institution in developing normative standards globally. And that's why we got into, next please, the adoption. And Ambassador Al-Mullah, you might be very proud because it was a fantastic moment to have 193 member states of UNESCO adopting this recommendation. And you see the General Conference President there and all the flags, which is fantastic. Next, please. What is the recommendation all about? It was drafted by 24 experts, global experts on many issues. And this was a fascinating way in which UNESCO does the thing. This was not only the geeks, this was not only the engineers, this was not only the economists, you have philosophers, historians, and really it brought the multidisciplinary aspect that we really appreciate in our work. It stated what are the values that we should protect in the digital space, the respect, protection, and promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms and human dignity, the environmental and ecosystem flourishing. And this is fantastic because you might have heard so many times human-centric AI, human-centric AI. Well, no, it has to be planet-centric because it's also, it has a very high energy intensity and impact in the environment. Ensuring diversity and inclusiveness, living in peaceful, just, and interconnected societies. So what you see is outcome-based. What outcomes do we want, and then how we do it. And how do we do it? With the principles of proportionality, of safety, fairness, sustainability, privacy, human oversight, and determination. And this is very important because with the black box and all this very complicated setting of parameters in the AI, sometimes even the developers doesn't know why the outcome deliver certain results. But at the end, it has to be human, the decision maker at the end. Transparency and explainability, responsibility and accountability, awareness and literacy, and multi-stakeholder and adaptive governance collaboration. These are the principles, but the beauty of the recommendation, and if we go to the next slide, is that it also goes into policy issues. And we believe if all these things don't translate into policies, into legislation, it doesn't really go far. And that's why we also cover all these chapters with very concrete policy recommendations on data, on gender, development, environment, health, communications, education, economy, and culture. And moreover, after that, member states also decided they wanted to have a very strong chapter for following up and implementation. These are some of the issues, ensuring the rule of law, human-centered AI, not abusing cognitive bias. I have to say that Algorithm Watch, that you might know, is this NGO that is super, super critical of everything that happens in the digital space. When the recommendation came out, they sent us a message congratulating UNESCO because we had put that it should not provide legal personality to AI developments. And this has been a discussion all over the world, and UNESCO said no, because at the end, it's a human who is behind that needs to take the decision. And then, of course, safeguards are needed for the protection of the rule of law, judicial independence, liability. This is something that I feel we're going to be commenting here. So this is a cardinal of issues, but it's really very strong in terms of the provisions. Next, please. Now, into the implementation, and I want to commend here Vilas from the Patrick McGovern, but also the European Commission, EMA, the Japanese government, so many partners that have come together to support the implementation on the ground, working with countries, looking at where they are in terms of their development and capacities to deal with these technologies in all the senses, and also helping to get recommendations to get closer to the benchmark that is the standard of UNESCO. We have elaborated 2 tools to standardize this movement: the readiness assessment methodology and the ethical impact assessment. But we also have a group of AI experts without borders. We are launching the Women for Ethical AI Network next week, I think, in New York, in the Committee of Status of Women. We have launched the Global Forum on the Ethics of AI. The Czech Republic hosted the very first one in the context of their presidency of the European Union. And we're going to bring the Observatory of AI Ethics. And I think this is really important. We were talking, Emma, how important it is to provide with cases to people to understand what we're talking about. So this is where we are. And I feel I would leave it there. I think we have something else in the graphs. get over that one, please. And these are some, just for starting the conversation, some of the issues that we are starting to get worried about in terms of fairness and non-discrimination, disinformation, responsibility, safety, privacy, environmental, because it's very intensive, but also education and research of ChatGPT. You know that with these technologies, it will change the way we produce research. It will change the way we produce science. It will even change the way that students access to their own learning processes and cognitive enhancements. So, and the real point here is that we don't know what's the outcome. So with that, this is what we're doing. This is the effort of UNESCO in terms of the ethics of AI. And so now let's get to the real issue here to see how do we move forward in this very important effort to ensure that the development of these technologies serve to help solve our problems and not to create more. So let me start with Vilas. Maybe you want to comment, Vilas, because you have been leading also in these efforts to look at the downsides, to control the downsides, but also to maximize the benefits. And the Patrick McGovern Foundation is supporting so many institutions, including UNESCO, in advancing this narrative. What have you learned from that? What are the good news? What are the bad news? What do you want to share here with our public?
Fantastic. Thank you, Gabriela. Thank you and good morning, everyone. It's a real delight to be here. I'm at UNESCO, and particularly to be part of a conversation hosted by the Social and Human Sciences Division. I think that's quite important, and I'm going to come back to that a few times in my remarks to identify exactly why it is that we're not talking about AI as just one more technology, but really as something that reshapes the human experience and requires us to bring not just a humanist perspective, but one that's driven, I will say, to begin to be provocative, one by love for humanity. But let's come back to that. Just a few days ago, and Gabriela shared that I have traveled across the world to be here, I was standing at Mount Everest at base camp at about 18,000 feet and looking around at one of the most remote parts of the world in awe of natural beauty. And maybe my own pathos as an AI expert, I also realized that I was standing on pebbles, on scree, on the kind of rough gravel that you see often when glaciers have receded. I realized that the place that I was standing on Mount Everest, a place of my dreams from my childhood, would have looked fundamentally different, not 50 years ago, but 10 years ago, 5 years ago, that where I was standing would have been covered by ice. This is not a conversation about climate change. But as I stood there, I also realized that if we had been equipped with the tools of AI modeling and risk prediction around weather patterns, if we could deploy what we know today about the effects of carbon and climate change, if we could even deploy those tools today to say, how do we remediate? How do we try to create new carbon sinks? How do we try to restore our natural order? We could really do something quite significant. The urgency that I feel around AI is not necessarily ChatGPT, a moment that has, I think, truly inspired many of us, that has created some new fears, that has gotten us all to our keyboards to go and see, can we write our next keynote using an online tool? But something much more fundamental, the idea that these technologies are more than just a way to communicate or to write speeches or to even critique and understand academic papers. These tools have the capacity to fundamentally redefine what the human experience looks like. Our relationship with the physical world around us, our capacity to find shared identity and community in digital spaces, our ability to envision a kind of creativity that we don't yet even have a vocabulary for. That AI is here and will stay has almost become a cliche. What I think we have not yet begun to engage with is, what does this truly mean for fundamental assumptions about human economic systems, about political frameworks, about what we value? I met recently with a set of managing partners of global law firms, the kinds of names that I think many of us are familiar with. And I said to them, what happens in a world where the work that your associates do are replaced by AI systems? Forget about 5 or 10 years of job displacement. What does it mean for a world where for 1,000 years we valued those who take on education to become actors in the rule of law, and 90% of what they do has become automated? Do we still value fundamental principles of human labor in the same way? Do we think about these institutions of power that have existed for so long as stable through a time of transition? These are questions that I live with, that I know many of us do, but let's bring them to a moment of immediacy, the critical urgency of figuring out how we come together to have a new conversation about what this means for society. I think here UNESCO's recommendations are particularly important. They bring us into a frame not merely to think about how the technology is developed or how they'll be deployed, but they help begin to create a framework in which we think about decisions of power, of decisions of economic justice, of decisions about whether we want to propagate the same unequal frameworks we've had through the last few decades of human development. Gabriela, you spoke briefly to the question of bias and fairness in ChatGPT. And I'm often asked, well, what does it mean if we were to give over control to machines that might bring bias? And my response is often that these machines don't bring new bias into systems. They don't merely act as a mirror for human society. In many ways, they act as a magnifying lens that actually take the biases that exist in our societies and for the first time give us an incredibly powerful investigative tool. I think about bias in hiring, a topic that I know has been predominant and prevalent in many of our conversations. But as we really began to understand where the technological bias came from, we realized that the algorithms weren't discriminating against people of a particular gender. They were merely reflecting the human behaviors that exist already in how we hire. They were magnifying them, they were accentuating them, they were creating a new mechanism by which we could interrogate our very core principles and ask, is this a world that we're comfortable living in even before we begin to think about AI? I'll share one last point here, again, a provocation for our conversation. You know, I've been a technologist and an AI expert for nearly all of my career. And I remember a time when I maybe could have looked across the globe and said there are maybe a few hundred, maybe a few thousand AI scientists who are out there building these technologies. It felt like a world in which we could easily regulate how these tools were developed and deployed through a combination of academic conferences and papers, through some opinion pieces, through the very robust personal networks of scientists and engineers who start, I think, always with good intention to build technologies that make the world a better place. We live in a fundamentally different world now, one where platforms like ChatGPT, themselves not products, but merely enablers of new kinds of consumer-facing technologies, mean that there are hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are directly engaged with the creation of products that will have a direct influence on people's lives, that will fundamentally create new vulnerabilities, even as we try to fix ones that exist in the world today. That's a different kind of political question. How do we not just regulate, but inspire positive behaviors? How do we create new incentives to build tools that make the world a better place, even as we try to shape and restrict the boundaries that prevent those possible and punitive harms? It means that our frameworks for how we think about policy have to change, that recommendations like those promulgated by the UNESCO team have to have new mechanisms for engaging with people where they are, that we can't simply rely on government policy that takes UNESCO recommendations and turn it into legislation. If today I can speak to those who are literally writing lines of code at their homes, building products that people will see in the next 2, 4, or 6 weeks, who have never really engaged with multilateral policy processes, who don't necessarily think of the UNESCO principles as their guiding light. So I'll leave you then with a question. If we truly believe, as I do, that principles like those promulgated by UNESCO are absolutely critical for a future in which AI tools are not merely pervasive, but a part of the human experience, how do we make sure that those who are creating those tools today have access to not merely the principles behind them, but those behavioral best practices, those concepts that make them wake up at 4 a.m. and say, maybe before I release this tool into the world, I need to ask a few more questions. Thank you very much.
Well, that's a fantastic way to start, because you turn it to us back. But from this very first inspiring statement, I think you have seen that what Bill has brought is how do we ensure accountability, how we ensure transparency, how do we ensure the rule of law, and all of the frameworks that we have built that shape certain behaviors. And that's fantastic. We actually are aspiring to have the ethical impact assessment used by everybody. And we know that we cannot codify anything, but yes, the incentives are super important. And maybe let me then switch to Emma, because Emma, you have been not only looking deep into all these elements, and I think that what brings us together also is this reflection that we can shape these technologies to deliver for good. We can try to channel it to help us address so many challenges that we are facing. And you have worked with legislators, and I think legislators have a key role to play here, although it's not an easy task. So can you share your thoughts there, Emma, please?
Of course. I'm delighted to be here this morning discussing such a crucial topic. Just to kind of give you the background on what the Institute of AI is, or how it's known, but it's set up as the Interparliamentary Forum on Emerging Tech. In my background as in tech policy and law, and about 20 years ago, I was handwriting letters to various countries around the world, trying to understand what they were doing to get fibre to the home. And in 2018, a legislator in the UK found he was doing something quite similar in relation to understanding AI policy, that actually this access to the information and the thinking and the policies around it for legislators was still not very readily accessible at all. And so in 2018, we got together and we founded this network of legislators that's global, and bringing legislators together to focus on specific areas around the application of AI. And so what we have found with working with legislators is that because of the nature of the political cycle these days, as Gabriela said, they are very much focused on the use cases around AI. In 2018, AI was, well, what is this? Whereas now, because if you look, Gabriela's slides indicate there is so much focus, there's so much investment going in, legislators pretty much around the world are focused on the opportunities, the industrial strategies, what to do to ensure that they don't miss out on this industrial strategy. Equally, they are concerned if it impacts their electorate. There are use cases. Vilas referred to kind of the impact on jobs. That's an absolute critical issue for a lot of legislators, because ultimately it will have a direct effect on the electorate. So, and if we take a step back, I can only just agree strongly with what Vilas was saying around the impact that AI can have. I have said before that it is the equivalent of electricity or railways. This is digital infrastructure. It will change the way that we operate in all parts of our lives. And I think without the kind of the recommendation that UNESCO has brought in, and people releasing products without them considering those ethical principles, then the risk is we are, as we move forward, we're defined by our past, not for our future. And there is a lot to miss out because there is a lot of bias in data. Now, I think the other issue around it as well is this validation point that people refer to a computer. So not only are we having decisions generated on this, that the AI gives you validation in your views or your position. And I think the other aspect that legislators are really focused on is how they improve the level of understanding in their electorates. How can people even scrutinize AI? We've seen it with data protection, GDPR. There was a wonderful set of rules around how people could protect their data, protect their privacy, and bring claims. However, that, although it's starting, it hasn't flowed all the way through, because there is an enforcement issue, there is an understanding and an enforcement issue. And so without the focus on the ex ante, you're relying on people to enforce rights post. And I think then it's too late. And our experience very much is that that's where legislators are focused as well. They want to understand the specifics, the specific industries. So how would AI be used within the financial services industry? How will it affect loan applications? What's the impact on education? What's the impact on the future of work? But there is a great deal of engagement. I also think that the beauty of what UNESCO is doing is very much bringing the conversation globally, whereas actually we can try it. We're at risk of being very local in our areas of focus, whether it's in Europe, the US, whereas this infrastructure, a bit like electricity, is going to be truly global. We are not disconnected from one another. And it's about setting the health and safety standards around this general purpose technology. But I do think legislators are struggling with a general principle basis. Thank you.
That brings us to the real complex issues that legislators and policymakers need to grapple with, and that's where we want to provide some insights of our work, in the sense that they have competing objectives. And competing objectives sometimes lead to be at the leading edge of the technology. You spoke about power distribution, and therefore then the outcome or the human outcome comes later when you are in this technological race. And I think this is one of the calls that we're making in terms of putting people at the center. So thank you, Emma. And here comes very, that was good. That was good. Now I want to give the floor to Lucila Scioli. She has been a great partner in the European Commission. And whenever we think about those that have been daring to look at what works in the regulatory framework is the EU. And therefore, Lucila, I want to give you the floor so that you can share with us the key features of the directives that you have just adopted. How do they deliver on what you are aiming at? How are you going to implement them? And how you think this can help move the discussion forward, and not only, as they say, leaving those that regulate behind. So over to you, Lucila.
Well, thank you very much, Gabriela. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important event. And I can only start with praising the recommendation of UNESCO, because obviously we have been, we're in the process of discussing a piece of legislation in the European Union. But I think that even in countries where there is no regulation or no legislation, having the recommendation of UNESCO and putting people at the center, as you said, is extremely important indeed, because we may want to be able to rely on the goodwill of those who design the artificial intelligence systems. But I think that we have learned throughout our history, and even in these days, that use of this system can be made also against the goodwill of those who designed it. And it is really the use that determines at the end of the day whether artificial intelligence systems are an opportunity or are actually a risk. And so it was just said now how important it is to look at artificial intelligence systems in their context. Having said that, in our analysis, the artificial intelligence problems or risk are always the same, whether you apply to the financial sector or whether you apply to a self-driving car or to a healthcare device. At the end of the day, the problem is the black box, and so what you need to do is to try to minimize this risk before these services or these devices are being put on the market. So this is the angle that was taken by the artificial intelligence sector, which is now being discussed by Council and Parliament. So we are actually waiting for the comments from the European Parliament. While the discussion with the Council, the Council of the European Union has already expressed its position. And the fact that the Council expressed its position also allows us to start thinking already about the implementation of the Act itself. And there are a couple of points I would like to raise today, because I didn't want to come to repeat again the Artificial Intelligence Act. I give it for granted that it is known. But what I would like to highlight is the fact that the legislation can also help to bring about innovation. And in fact, a concept we have introduced in the legislation and that we start testing to, we are starting to test its implementation, is the context of regulatory sandboxes, which you know, we have borrowed, of course, the concept from the financial area, where this has already been applied in many different ways. And we take these sandboxes basically to be controlled environments where innovators can test artificial intelligence applications in a way that is safe and that is also controlled. And so with these regulatory sandboxes, in a way, we give space for regulators to monitor and evaluate the use of AI. And so the regulators can assess the risk and the benefits of the technologies that are being tested, and they can make informed decisions about how to regulate them. So they play a very important role, and also an innovative role, I think. We foresee that it is a regulatory authorities in the different European member states that would be designated to set up these sandboxes. And at the moment, what we are trying to do is to anticipate a little bit this setup, and we're working in particular with Spain to prepare a first regulatory sandbox so that we can test in practice how the sandbox can work and what are the criteria and the main characteristics it has to have to be really useful. And so we will then take into account the results of this testing that we are doing with the Spanish authorities. And we have invited other member states, of course, to join the Spanish example. In the meanwhile, we have also set up some organization that we call testing experimentation facilities, which will also offer sandboxes. And so we will be able to also experiment in real world settings, in particular when the artificial intelligence systems is maybe embedded in a physical robot or that needs a physical space, to see what kind of impact it will have. And so basically, just to conclude, I simply think that on top of the legislation, the possibility to create a safe and controlled environment for companies to test their applications is a way of encouraging innovation and making sure that artificial intelligence is developed in a safe, ethical way and respects fundamental rights. And so for us, it's a very important practical way also to implement the legislation. And it is a framework that we want to provide, and maybe also something that can be discussed and maybe also borrowed by other countries in the global setting. So thank you very much again, and thank you for inviting.
Thank you, Lucila. And I really like that because, yes, let's applaud Lucila. I really like that because the European Union, of course, adopted this risk-based approach and is trying to advance with so many definitions. But what we've heard is that it really needs to be tailored. It needs to be framed. It needs to be experimented. It needs to be, because it's not a straightforward answer for building the laws and regulations. And in this sense, Kerstin, you actually have been looking around the world about laws, regulations, institutions. This is the core of the UNESCO recommendation. Of course, we are very fond of the definitions, but we will be much more interested in how do we implement, what kind of regulations, what kind of institutions, who is leading on this, and what would you recommend there, Christine?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. It's a big honor to be here today. So what we did in, I prepared some slides, maybe, yeah. Okay, I'll just give another second. So what we do in our research is we try to, or in one of our major research projects is we try to, how can I make this work? Okay, can you please go to the next slide? So here on this overview, you can just see that we have a race to the top among the world's leaders in AI. And as we will see, and as we have already talked before about this, we can see that the laws play a major role because the law shapes the strategy. And we will also later discuss the functions of the law, and that shapes who can also be the leader in AI across countries. One back, please. So what we can see is that we have these developments in technology. And as Gabriela mentioned, these technologies move and develop very rapidly. We then in general have first ethical frameworks that are being developed. And last, eventually, we then have laws. So often the legislators are last to join the party, and laws develop very slowly. So we see here that we have some challenges because of the technologies moving that rapidly. Next slide, please. What we now did is we tried to understand empirically, looking at different countries, so the US, the EU, and European countries such as France, UK, Germany, Switzerland, and we wanted to understand what are the regulatory activities. And as you can see on this slide here, the US and the EU represented, but be aware the y-axis, you can see that it has another metric on both jurisdictions. So for the US, it goes up to 175, while in the EU, it does not. And so what we can see is, sorry, I can't see my slides anymore. Thank you. Thank you. We have many bills introduced with a focus on AI, and this is across all policy areas. So this can be finance, mobility, health, others. But we can also see, so first of all, we can see an increase, and the reason why 2022 is not a further increase is because we only looked at until mid-2022. It's already an older study. So what we can see across all countries is that we have an increase, and also that there are many bills introduced. But if you look at the US, we can also see that many, that's the darker blue, are also rejected. So not all bills that are being brought into the parliament are also actually being enforced. And I think that's an important takeaway. So it can also be understood, these bills, as a freedom of speech and as strategies, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're also being enforced. Next slide, please. Here you can see other examples, France and Germany, and we can see in general the same pattern. So in general, an increase over time. In general, only a small fraction being actually implemented, many being introduced, but also many then being rejected. Next slide, please. And here, the last two countries, same patterns. We can see most activities, so we can also see differences across jurisdictions. So the US has the most activities in terms of introduction of bills addressing AI. And then we have countries such as Switzerland, my home country, with the least activities of AI introductions. Next slide, please. Now, the law has different functions. It can either have an enabling function, which we can see very nicely with the AI bills. So, for example, the US has multiple bills that doesn't say, for example, this is not allowed, or, we address bias X, Y, Z way, but they also have many enabling functions. What do I mean by that? They, for example, state in a bill how many millions or billions of US dollars shall be invested for the development of AI. Or they have a bill that addresses how AI should already be implemented and introduced in high school, for example. So this can be understood as an enabling function of AI. On the other hand, often also in Europe, we can see the typical understanding of regulation, so a more preventing function. So how can we make sure that the fundamental rights, such as non-discrimination, can be respected? So we have to think about what for a function should the law on national and international level have, because depending on that, we shape AI in a different way, and AI will be implemented differently across countries. So however we shape AI in terms of regulatory aspects, that has direct consequences for science, innovation, etc. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at how countries regulate, we can in general distinguish between two major approaches. One is the sectoral approach, which we can see in many national countries. So, for example, France is keen on regulating national security, so as one policy area. Or, for example, Switzerland focuses on the regulation of AI and mobility. And also the US in general, apart from their horizontal vision across all policy areas, they strongly focus on the different sectors. One slide further, please. What we can now see, and that's different in the EU has a horizontal approach. So, and next slide, please. What we can see here is that we have an EU AI Act, it's a draft currently, that goes through all sectors. So it regulates finance, mobility, medicine, public sector, and you name it. Just everything that deals with AI is encompassed by the EU AI Act. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here you can see also the specific objectives of the EU AI Act. So we can see that the fundamental rights are really at the core. So the EU AI Act has a more regulatory function compared to the enabling function that I explained before. Next slide, please. And what the EU AI Act does is it distinguishes between the risk levels. So, for example, harmful AI practices are per se not allowed, but then they distinguish between low risk and high risk. And the higher the risk, the more regulations are being put into force, potentially in the future. It's still a draft for now. Next slide, please. And here, just very briefly, an example of for high risk AI technologies, we can, for example, see in the law that the training, validation, and testing data shall be relevant, representative, free of errors, and complete. If you think about it, AI means that we have a lot of data involved. How can you make sure that all this data is free of error? This is a provocative question, but what I want to show with this is that the question is, how can this then really be implemented, and how can we make sure that this can really work out free of errors? I mean, it's already hard if you think about data that maybe you collect or data that you have or, you know, that you're working with. It's probably already very hard to say if all of these data points are free of error, right? So how much more if you have millions of data points, let's say thousands of patients, for example, involved with all their patient history. How can you make sure that each of that data point is accurate and correct? Just as one provocative example. Next slide, please. There are also many other requirements and provisions that the EU AI Act encompasses. For example, with regard to transparency, we already touched base on that, our former speakers did. Next slide, please. So I would like to conclude and also frame an outlook. What we can see and what I try to show to you is that we have on the one hand either a sectoral approach followed by most countries and jurisdictions versus a horizontal approach, something that we can see in the EU. So we have to think, what do we want? Each country has to be aware about that because it does have implications. Then we also have to think about, both on national and international level, what should the function be? Do we want to enable? Do we want to prevent? Do we want to combine? We also have to keep in mind less is often more, because technologies change so quickly, so rapidly. Law is so slow. So we have to make sure that we are flexible enough and that we don't regulate too much, in my opinion, to keep pace with the technologies. And important too, we need a cooperation, because AI is not just a national phenomenon, but as we see, it shapes the world. So we have to make sure that we cooperate. Next slide, please. And so with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. And in case of questions, please feel free to contact me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. That was amazing. I actually didn't know that the US was so active legislating but not adopting, which is quite interesting in terms of the conversation. And also, I really like the way you put it in terms of enabling or regulating, because at the end is what you said, Vilas, is everywhere. So you can even go and try to fix whatever the AI is doing in the financial sector, But that doesn't really mean whether you are putting an ethical guardrails. Maybe you're just making sure that it's well used or deployed in certain sectors. And I think this comes to the reflection that I want to ask. I think it's Rainer Cadel that follows from in the connection, because what you see in this landscape that Christine just showed to us is that there is no one single answer. Legislators are looking to incentivize, as you said. They want to have more investments. They want to have more startups. They don't want to be lag behind in this technological race. But at the same time, you have others that want to pursue protection of human rights. So these trade-offs. And one of the narratives, and I want to bring Rainer here, that we have heard a lot, is that the more you regulate, the less you innovate. And at UNESCO, we do not believe that. We actually believe that effective regulation, not more or less, effective regulation can be much more an environment, an enabling environment for more investments and actually more sustainable. So Rainer, if you're there, could you share with us how UCL is addressing this issue of these trade-offs or false trade-offs that we consider are not really at odds? Is he there?
Yes. Yes, I'm here. Yes. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Thank you.
Oh, perfect. Excellent. Yeah, and thanks so much for the invitation, Gabriela. And I've really enjoyed the panel so far. So excellent discussions. And yeah, I think as you said, the mythology around regulation that is constraining innovation is of course completely false, because we have many industries that are very heavily regulated and where there's lots of innovation going on, from medicines to pharmaceuticals to food to construction. All of those industries are actually very heavily regulated. But indeed, the question is, what do we use the regulation for? And I think that, as Kirsten was already saying in the previous intervention, that really we can view regulation as something that constrains entrepreneurial activity, but we can also think of regulation as something that actually enables entrepreneurial activity as well. And I think this is very key to understand the differences. And particularly, I think in something like AI, to see the regulation as an enabling factor is very important, because otherwise we really have a race to the bottom. And so what we don't want to have is companies competing on having less and less sort of ethical guardrails in their work and environment. So, and because that, when we end up with having actually less markets and less competition, this is something that we don't actually really want. So I think this is where the AI, the regulatory challenge is. So how do we actually build both constraints and enablers into regulations and do it in a way that is actually helpful to have healthy markets, rather than just oligopolistic markets where one or two companies or one or two countries are dominating. I think this is where really the key challenge for AI regulations and AI policymakers is. And I think one of the things that we haven't perhaps discussed today enough is the difference between uncertainty and risk. So I think, of course, AI being a general purpose technology, there will be a lot of applications for AI. And some of those applications we can today calculate the risks of, or we can understand the risks, or we can understand the potential harms of those technologies. And thus we can also try to regulate those harms and the risks. But I think there's also much more wider issue around uncertainty that AI brings in many sectors of the economy and many sectors of human activity. And this is something that is difficult to regulate for or think about even in principle. So I think what we need to also think about is not only regulations, but also institutional, what we can call countervailing powers. So can we actually build institutions that are there to stop and to in some ways slow down the development of AI and development of technology? And I think this is very important to think, what kind of institutions are they? Because today we are talking very much about sort of the levels of parliaments and the way we think about AI on the levels of parliaments, which is of course very important. But can we also think about the way we actually incentivize companies to use ethically AI? And because these kind of companies should have a certain advantage, obviously, because we want them to be more competitive than competitors that don't use AI ethically. And so this is very much thinking around innovation as an ecosystem rather than a competition between different companies and different technologies. I think this is where we can really learn from digital markets and digital platforms. But I think what has happened over the last 10 years or 15 years in digital economy, we see that there is a very uneven competition in terms of we have very powerful platforms from Amazons to Googles to others. And I think this has actually hampered innovation by smaller companies. And it has really actually led to a very extractive ecosystem where large companies can extract enormous profits and rents from this ecosystem, but actually smaller companies and also smaller countries, and particularly developing countries, are actually not being able to gain as much from these systems. So I think we have this unhealthy innovation ecosystems that we don't want in AI to happen. And I think regulation and ethical principles are really important for that, but it's also we have to think about innovation ecosystems. So how do we provide ecosystems where there actually is healthy competition, and hence the idea that we need to think about enablers for AI markets as well. And I think, as we heard in the beginning, Gabriela, from you as well, one of the challenges we at the moment face is that private companies invest more in AI than governments do. And it's not only investment, but if you look at the leading publications in AI are coming today from Google rather than any other university or government institution. So I think we are stepping into a very dangerous domain when we actually don't really understand what we're trying to regulate, or even more importantly, we don't understand as public policymakers so well what we are actually trying to create an ecosystem for. So when we talk about healthy innovation ecosystems, I think we need to step up massively investment into AI, only because to learn what actually happens in these applications of AI across the board. And hence, I think the public investment into AI is really part of the healthy ecosystem, because that makes sure that not only regulators, but also people who work in various sectoral ministries, agencies, actually understand better the technology that is emerging. And I think what we see in terms of like globally, what countries are trying to do, we see I think a very dangerous trends emerging where countries in the global south are starting to invest because of industrial policy, innovation policy reasons, as we heard before, because it's an international competition we are now in, and they are investing into human resources, into the education, but also trying to build technology. And what we see is that a lot of this flows into global north then. And I think this sort of a very uneven development, or having like global south subsidizing global north in AI, is something that we really don't want to see. So I think this kind of thinking about AI regulation as actually market shaping for public good and developing domestic capabilities, both in regulation, but also domestic companies who can actually apply AI in construction or food or whatever, what have you. I think it's very important to, otherwise we again are in the similar sort of space as we are in digital markets, where we have a global, very uneven competition and very unhealthy and very much an extractive environment. And this is something that we don't want. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rainer. And I think this is one of the goals that we pursued in UNESCO, to have the Global South very well represented in this debate, because as Rainer said, it's true. I mean, some of the data that we have is China and the US being the developers of 80% of all what is in the market, and 85% of the developments are made by male-only teams, usually white male. Nothing wrong with that, but it's just not so diverse. And therefore, it's just a reproduction of very exclusive patterns of development that we need to address. And I think that this is a very important comment, because what we're trying to do is also, we develop the recommendation with the Global South participating and bringing their voice and their content and what they wanted to see there. And I guess this explains why we got the environment much more present, and more philosophical reflections of how interlinked we are as humans and societies, and therefore is richer in that sense. But going back to the task at hand, which is not so simple, Anicia, you have been at the core of the Namibia's efforts in developing the national AI strategy, bringing the conversation together with multiple stakeholders, bringing the different ministries, because the regulations you were mentioning, ministries don't have the same goals. And it depends on who you talk to. They might have a different view of what needs to be done. And so how have you managed, Anicia, to get this whole of the government approach and to put the ethical perspective, the human rights perspective at the center?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me on this panel. Now, before I start with that, I actually want to just deviate a little bit and comment on the remark that was made by Rainer just now. And this is that there are several universities and organizations involved in an effort to develop an Africa AI curriculum. So this has been going on for quite a while. And this is precisely because we want to infuse, because how does an AI react or reflect our cultures, our norms, our value systems, many of which is not written or doesn't exist in any data form because it's oral. So those are the type of things that we're looking at the moment. But this is not the discussion point now. However, yes. So for Namibia, the president established a 4IR task force in 2021, and we were an 8-member task force, and the job was that we should conduct a country readiness assessment to leverage 4IR technologies. And then we also had to have a national AI or 4IR conference. And my brief was further that, and all of this you have to do without a budget attached to it because we don't have money. Okay, so I had to solicit all of the money as well. So the first thing that came up when this was announced was, of course, there was a public outcry, very negative. The public felt that why, in 4IR task force, when we have so many other things to concentrate on. Why are you looking at AI? Because initially we decided to look just at AI, but then we decided to widen it up. When we have a food crisis, water, energy, etc. And second of all, AI is coming for our jobs. So that was basically the rhetoric that we had, from the public. And that's what we had to work with. So the other problem that we had was the tools, because looking at our particular context as an African country, we didn't really find many readiness assessment tools that we could readily deploy, which meant that we took a bit of time to sort of work on that and came up with a tool that we've developed, but that also it had 3 parts, and one of the parts was actually the future of production of the World Economic Forum that we embedded in that, but we padded it with our own context around it as well. So the other problem then was the, different actors have different resources and have different interests. And we adopted a theme of 4IR as an enabler of an inclusive and green industrialization. Now, the green was because Namibia is positioning itself to be a green hydrogen hub. And we were also looking at green IT. And in that connection, I've actually established a Green Hydrogen Research Institute, which has one of its centers focusing on digital technologies, in particular AI as well. And then the inclusive part is our president normally says it's one Namibia house. And in that one Namibia house, no one is to be left out. So we went for inclusivity. We want to bring everybody along, but it's also very difficult. And I mean, it's a task that even if you strive to be that noble, you will fail, because there are certain regions within Namibia that they're just so far apart from others, so that you have to do the development asymmetrical. It will never be the same, but at least we brought everybody on board. Okay, so fast forward. We then brought all of the ministries together because there's a huge coordination problem. Coordination because so many of their functions are overlapping or are duplicating. For instance, there are 4 ministries who are responsible for technology, as an example, which means that you don't get the job done because there's not one responsible for the implementation thereof. So necessarily one of our recommendations was, we had 13, and the first one was that we need to have a 4IR commission overseeing the implementation, because you couldn't give it to just these ministries and say, please see what you can do. The second thing is that everybody had a strategy. Every single person who walked through the door when we had the consultation workshops would say, no, we need a strategy for this, we need a strategy for this. And as I say, some of them were duplicating, some of them had parts here and parts there. So we said, no, we have to have a consolidated overall 4IR strategy, and then we plug in all of these small strategies that you're developing, like a digital transformation strategy, etc. We plug them all in, and then that gets overseen by this commission. Of course, we looked at areas such as future of work. We looked at education. Probably the harshest for us was that the harshest criticism that we gave was on education. And I think that was the biggest part of it, because we looked across the entire spectrum, and we will not be ready for the future of work or for any AI development or anything if we do not have the skills, if we do not build the skills, etc. The other one that was big was legislation. And here we worked with the World Economic Forum again to develop a 4IR toolkit, through which we are basically, it's a lens through which we put every single bill that is coming in. And this was on the request of the Minister of Justice, to basically look at, is it an enabler? Is it a disabler? What needs to change? But legislation is a very big problem in Namibia because it is very, very slow moving. But we do have the parliamentarians saying, yeah, but we want a little bit more training because we do want to understand it. Okay, so after we sort of invited many of the stakeholders, we invited them to so many consultation meetings that we had with them, where they come into the room, they give us the pain points. Eventually, later on, we had people who are on opposing sides, and instead of giving us pain points, they gave us solutions, and they were working with each other. So that strategy seemed to have worked wonderfully, and we got the buy-in almost from everybody that we engaged with. Now, eventually, the narrative changed also on the public side, on social media, etc., that they didn't have this predominantly negative view anymore. You still had naysayers, but predominantly the narrative had changed. And it was because with our 4IR conference, we had an expo, and we showcased what youth are doing in areas where you think, oh my goodness, I didn't even know that they would have the skills to build AI tools, for instance. And so that changed a lot of things. Now, in conclusion, amongst all of these recommendations, there were 2 things that I want to touch on. One is data. We have a huge problem with data in Namibia. And this is one thing that came out very clear in the recommendations on establishing a national green data center, and then everything data related. But the other thing is also that we will be establishing a national AI Institute for responsible, ethical, and inclusive AI development and R&D. And with that, I think I've given myself a very big job, because at the time when we gave the recommendations, the cabinet immediately thereafter instructed to all of the ministries and etc. that they needed to be actioned. And I will be assuming the position of the CEO of the National Research, Science and Technology Regulator and Funding Agency as from next week. And now I have to establish the AI Institute. That's what cabinet had ordered. Thank you.
Beware of what you want, Anicia, because you might get it. Well, but that really exemplifies, and I think all of the comments of the speakers have exemplified how complex is to really try to shape the direction of these technologies in a way that delivers for people. It has to do with coordination inside the government. It has to do with learning and the competing objectives. It has to do with what you're saying, the whole construction of how this is really impacting everything and how you produce regulations. And this is where I feel that the recommendation that UNESCO adopted is helping a lot in terms of framing the issues, because at the end, at least we should be in agreement that we need to change courses in terms of how things are developed. I want to open the floor. We have just around 13 minutes, but if anybody from the public wants to raise their hand and make a, there you go. And I will go for several, Adam. 1, 2, and that's it. Okay, we'll start 3. 1, 2, 3. Go for it. And if you can introduce yourself, please.
I first?
Yep.
Good morning. My name is Frits Israel. I work with AGI Laboratory. We are a company that's developing what we believe is the next level AI. And we've tried to contact UNESCO. We tried to contact legislators and regulators. But the problem that we see is that we don't get the attention, because it doesn't sound realistic that a small company can build something like this. So I've been for 6 months trying to get a hold of somebody, say, can you look at what we're doing? Because we want to make sure that we're doing it the right way. So if you're talking about all the possibilities and all the regulations and the ethics you want to take place, but you don't give the platform to the people that are developing it, like it was said, it might be somebody behind their desk doing something amazing. But if you don't give access to the possibility of sharing it with you, then you get these people going rogue, or at least not regulated. So that was my question. If there's a way that you can provide access to the technology, the knowledge and the recommendations that you provide, so that you can actually start guiding people the right way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you. My name is Adam. I'm the Permanent Delegate Kuwait at UNESCO. First of all, I have a comment, then a question for the researcher from University of Zurich. First of all, my comment is, why this recommendation is good. Just to brief, the people is, we made sure, the member states and the secretariat leading by the ADG, we want some recommendation that's practical, that's, applicable. We have a lot of recommendation, but this is, and we were lucky, to be honest, it was COVID when the negotiation, because it was the meeting online. And by the way, it was this room where all the negotiation happened. So it was online. So it was accessibility for all member states than the typical for them to come to Paris, where sometimes, they don't have the resources. So the online helped us to have inclusive. And to us was the main thing is, we know the technology is so fast, but we need something that member state, when they are, committed, they don't need to go more in details. This is ready made for them to be implemented right away. So this is from the recommendation point of view. I have a question for the researcher from Zurich. And excuse me, I couldn't catch the name, and I'm wearing my glasses. You said in your first initial slides that, the legislation is the last part, first the technology, the last part, and usually it takes more time. Then on top of that, a lot of those legislation goes to the decision makers, or to be adopted, but at the same time, they will not be adopted. So it's, you have double actions. They're slow, and majority of them are rejected. So I think, we need to think the approach of bringing those legislation, not the content, because before, we have the luxury of the time, but now we don't have the luxury of time. I think we need to reshape the approaching of bringing the legislation to the parliaments or to the any governing bodies, because this is, I think this is the bottleneck. We have to rethink of our approach instead of the content. This is just, to me, is, from the reverse engineering, we really need to look at that details. Otherwise, we are going to the same circles, Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adam. And yes, it's great that the member states are there to say this works and it's operational. I have this question, and then I will give the floor to the speakers, and we'll see if we have a little bit more time for these two additional, please. I think you need to push the red button. So, yep.
Thank you. Thank you for the point. My name is Vincent Obia, a PhD researcher from Birmingham City University, and I have a question for Anicia. Really fascinating talk on what's happening in Namibia. And I think something similar is happening in Nigeria also. We're coming up with this national artificial intelligence policy that the government is thinking about. And the kind of strategies you mentioned in Namibia. And I was wondering, in terms of the wider global south now, because what I tend to find is countries in the global south, in Africa and Nigeria, for instance, tend to, when it comes to issues like artificial intelligence regulation, tend to, should I say, copy or duplicate what happens in the global north sometimes. And it becomes a challenge in terms of how we can come up with strategies and policies that fit into the African context in some ways. So I was wondering also, and a lot has been said about the fact that, there's this uneven competition, uneven regulation between the global north and south. So what role do you think countries like in Africa and the wider global south can play in terms of balancing that level playing field when it comes to the wider multi-stakeholder discourses that happen in terms of regulation? What role can African countries play to kind of level this playing field and be more assertive in terms of artificial intelligence regulation? Thank you.
We have 3 questions and we have 7 minutes. So what I suggest that we assign one to Vilas, which is this very important question of how can we ensure inclusiveness, how can we have access, how can you were directed directly, Kirsten, by Ambassador Almula. And I would say that this last question concerns you both, because you work with the legislators also of the Global South. So shall we go in that way, please?
Well, let me speak to this this question about how individual technologists find access, get attention. I think you're actually speaking to a pretty profound indictment, and one that I believe in wholeheartedly, that the institutions we have today are not set up to do exactly what you described, to operate in a world where individual or small organizational innovation has the opportunity to really transform what the cutting edge of a field looks like. It can't be a fair proposition to say that every individual who's doing this work should have access to a UNESCO or a UN agency, right? But in that lacuna and that negative space is a real opportunity. When we looked at the history of how public health became a field, and it really only took about 15 to 20 years to go from a world where you had access only to your care provider to a world where in the US we had county boards of health, we had research agencies, we had the CDC, we had a flowering of institutions that grew because we had to serve a need. I think this technological transformation we're in creates the same moment, the need to re-envision institutions where technologists can directly engage with policymakers inside of new bodies that don't even exist yet. Now, I know that's quite again, I've been making a few of these today, right? That's quite a provocative statement. But other than that, there's not really a sense of fairness or a sense of engagement. If we say we expect our technologists to work in ethically oriented ways, and then we say, but there's not really an interface where you can come and engage with those who are setting forward principles. So I appreciate the work I think that UNESCO in particular is doing, is to saying, let's open up new ways of engagement. But I think the natural evolution has to be new institutions.
Quite a way to conclude, Vilas. We're taking note of that, but I completely agree. Kirsten, please.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, I think you make a very valid point when you say that we should rethink the approach instead of the content. I couldn't agree more. We could see that already in the past. So, I mean, we do have already AI for quite a few years. But if you think about, for example, gene editing in medicine, the decade before AI, we could see that so many things happened in technology and countries were overwhelmed of how they should regulate it and what should be possible and how do we want that people can actually change their genes, right, in the next generation of genes. And now we have exactly the same issue with AI, our today's topic, and we can see that the technology moves even more rapidly. So your point is so valid. I couldn't agree more. One big challenge is how can we think ahead? How, we have to think about how it could shape our world, how the technology could develop, and try to capture that. But I think you're right. We should think ahead, and we should think about now already as policymakers, as legislators, as a community. How do you want to shape our future for technology that could evolve, maybe not just now, but could evolve quickly in the upcoming years?
Thank you so much, Kirsten. Emma, Anicia.
We have many policies already, across African countries that we've shaped ourselves, and some of them are even regional, right? So for me, how I see strategy and policy development is that you have usually a model, because some of your fundamentals might be the same. Like, for instance, the recommendation on the ethics of AI, right? There are some fundamentals in there that you want to see in any policy that you do. So that is good, but how do you contextualize that then to your specific situation? And this is then where you bring on board, for instance, we have the AU digital strategy, but then we also have the ATU 4IR strategy, which contains your AI elements within that. So you look across these, and then you look also again across countries to see what do you need to slot in. But if you want to talk, if you're talking about the global South, it's very wide. It has everyone in. That's why I kind of try to focus on Africa, because if I talk about others, then I might not be saying the right things. But you have these regional bodies as well that will give direction. This is where we need to go. For instance, the AU Agenda 2063 clearly outlines, and that you can already contain within those policies. We can perhaps connect afterwards as well, because I'd be interested to know what you're doing as well.
I'll keep it very brief, but this also picks up on the ambassador's point around legislators. What we have created is a network that allows legislators to become engaged, to be able to scrutinize other pieces of legislation, because actually when we've done our kind of own internal research, we have found that, for instance, AI got mentioned, I think it was 23 times last year in the UK. It's all in relation to the budget. Actually, there was no proper, nothing of any substance. Whereas, for instance, if you look in the US, there's an executive order that's just come out around, against racial discrimination within the White House staff. That has massive, huge impacts on racial equity and, how that will flow through to AI. And what we have been trying to do is, through our network, increase the understanding, the knowledge level. There is so much to do. And actually, by building these networks across the countries, legislators can draw on different resources, understanding that they need to be adapted for their own local circumstances. But actually, we don't all have to do the thinking for ourselves. That when we bring ourselves together, we can create tools that can transfer into other countries, but also draw out issues that may be of consideration. And I think that's where I'll end, is the tools that UNESCO have created are the safety rails in that. And it's for the private sector and for the public sector to recognize them as that. Actually, for a private sector to say, for us to be able to assess as an individual, these are the parts of the recommendation that haven't been followed when I'm using this tool. Whether you've got another option is for competition purposes, but actually that's the litmus test. And I think that's from our perspective, that's how we see it. And our objective is to make those connections and allow the legislators to understand and to be able to scrutinize how emerging tech and AI can be brought into other pieces of legislation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are at the end of our time allocated to this panel. I just want to say that there's nothing more exciting for UNESCO than to have these champions, because you have heard them. They trust what we are doing. They know what we are doing, and they have been accompanying us on this journey. The fact is that what the member states did, led by Ambassador Al-Mullah, was to provide with a framework that is not only stating the what, but also the how. And I think this is really important because the how gets very complex, as we have heard for each one of you. How do you do it depending on the context, depending on the country, depending on the institutions, the legislation, but we are all bound together and the belief that we can deliver for good with these technologies and that there is a way to do it. And I can promise you that we will see each other next time and we will have make progress because now with the readiness assessment and with the ethical impact assessment, we have now 40 countries signing in, including with the very strong support of the Patrick McGovern Foundation, but many countries that are coming, the CAF in Latin America, the European Commission in Africa, Europe is coming, the Netherlands has to implement the readiness assessment, because at the end, what we're doing is having this movement. It's a movement of people like-minded that want to build a world where the AI delivers for good. And therefore, watch this space because we hope that we will be able to give more results. We feel strong because we have these partners. It has been my pleasure to be your moderator or to lead this conversation. It has been a pleasure to have you, and we'll keep working together. Thank you so much.